Russia is burning, not metaphorically or literally. In the broken tree lines east of Pokrovsk, in the gray scrubland behind Russia's own front trace in Donbas, a $67 million Buk M3 air defense complex sits as a blackened skeleton of twisted steel and cooked missile tubes. Its radar mast is split open like a cracked rib. Its transporter erector launcher is fused to the ground beneath it. And here is the part that should disturb every officer who studies this war seriously. That system was not killed by a long-range American missile. It was not killed by a stealth platform. It was killed because the Russian crew turned it on, lit up the sky, and committed itself to a target that did not exist, a target Ukraine put there on purpose to bait the radar into screaming its own coordinates into the open air. This is not a story about one missile system. This is a case study in why the entire Russian air defense architecture in Donbas is now operating on assumptions that no longer hold, and why the doctrinal failure underneath this incident has been compounding quietly for almost 2 years. What you are witnessing is not bad luck for one regiment. What you are witnessing is the systemic dismantling of a layered defense that Moscow still believes is intact. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened in that tree line, but why it was always going to happen the moment Ukraine industrialized cheap decoys at scale. I have spent decades studying how armies move, how they cover themselves, and how they die. I commanded U.S. Army Europe. I watched the Russian General Staff build the Buk and S-400 family as the backbone of their integrated air defense, the IADS, and I will tell you plainly, what happened in Donbas this month is one of the cleanest doctrinal kills I have seen in this war. Not because Ukraine fired the better missile, because Ukraine forced Russia to fire the worse one. Let that sink in for a moment. The Russians destroyed their own $67 million system by being tricked into using it. And the operation that triggered it was almost certainly carried out by the Ghosts, the primary unit of Ukrainian defense intelligence, the same group that, in a single 2-week window, has now systematically reduced a Tor M1, a Buk M3 radar, and a 55K6 command post belonging to the S-400 battery network across the Donbas line. That is not a streak. That is a campaign. Now pull the lens back, because to understand why this matters, you have to understand what Russia thought it was doing when it pushed this air defense forward in the first place. Rewind to early 2024. Russia's theory of Donbas air defense rested on 3 assumptions, and all 3 of them were wrong. The first assumption was that mass would compensate for vulnerability. Moscow believed that by stacking Tor M, 1 short-range systems, Panzer point defense, Buk M3 medium range, and S-400 long-range coverage in overlapping bubbles, they could create a layered shield over the Donetsk axis that no Ukrainian platform could penetrate without catastrophic loss. On paper, that math worked. On paper, the Buk M3 alone, a system whose export variant has been priced in the $45 to $67 million band, depending on configuration and missile load, can engage 36 targets simultaneously, track aircraft at 70 kilometers, and intercept cruise missiles at low altitude. That is a serious capability. That is not a toy. The second assumption was that radar emissions could be managed. Russian air defense doctrine, inherited from Soviet PVO tradition, assumes the operator controls when the radar radiates. You emit, you engage, you shut down, you displace. Emission discipline is the entire survival logic of a mobile SAM system. If you radiate too long, you die. Every Russian Buk crew knows this. Every Russian S-400 commander knows this. And yet 2 years into the drone war, that doctrine has been quietly inverted. The third assumption, and this is the one that destroyed the system in Donbas, was that the threat envelope would behave the way it behaved in 1999, or 2008, or even 2014. Russia built its Donbas air defense to kill manned aircraft, cruise missiles, and tactical ballistic missiles. It did not build it to survive a swarm of $2,000 plywood drones flying nap of the earth, augmented by AIQ decoys, fed real-time targeting by satellite reconnaissance, and supervised by a GUR unit whose entire job is to provoke radars into committing suicide. The threat changed. The doctrine did not. And here is the broader lesson. When your assumptions stop matching the battlefield, your most expensive systems become your most expensive coffins. What happens next changes everything. So let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. By mid-2024, the Ukrainians had figured out something the Russians have still not absorbed. The single most valuable target on the Donbas line was no longer infantry. It was no longer armor. It was no longer artillery. It was the radar, specifically the 9S-36M target acquisition radar of the Buk M3 and the 92N6E engagement radar of the S-400. Kill those and you do not just remove a missile system, you tear a 30-kilometer hole in the air defense bubble through which every Ukrainian Bayraktar, every long-range Lyuchi drone, every modified An-196 can pour, unmolested, into the Russian operational rear. So Ukraine industrialized the kill chain. They began producing thousands of cheap, expendable decoy drones, many of them based on the parity and similar foam and plywood airframes, designed to look like real cruise missiles or attack drones on radar, but costing a fraction of the price. They paired those decoys with real strike drones. They paired both with intelligence cueing from Western space-based assets and from their own ELINT, electronic intelligence, collection. They wired the whole thing into the primary unit's targeting network, and then they waited. The pattern that emerged in March, April, and into the spring of 2026 is now undeniable. Ukraine's drone forces and the GUR Ghost unit have doubled the rate of Russian air defense destruction compared to late 2025. The Security Service of Ukraine alone reported destroying roughly $4 billion worth of Russian air defense assets across 2025, S-400 batteries, S-300s, Buk variants, Panzers, and supporting radars. $4 billion. Let that figure sit. That is not attrition. That is hemorrhage. And it gets even more serious from here, because the kill rate is no longer the headline, the method is the headline. This is the hidden military variable that mainstream coverage keeps missing. When you see a report that says Ukraine destroyed a Russian Buk in Donbas, what you are almost certainly looking at is not a single drone finding a single target. What you are looking at is a multi-phase deception operation in which Ukraine deliberately presented the Russian radar with a target it could not afford to ignore, forced the crew to break a mission discipline, and then exploited the resulting radar signature to deliver a precision strike against the emitter itself. In the case of the Buk M3 killed in Donbas, the sequence almost certainly went like this. Phase 1. Ukraine launches a small package of decoy drones along a vector that simulates a deep strike profile toward a high-value Russian rear target, a fuel depot, an ammunition node, a command bunker. The decoys are deliberately flown high enough and slow enough to be unmistakable on Russian radar. They look like Lyuchi-class strike drones. They look like a real raid. Phase 2, the Buk M3 crew, sitting in their tree line near the front, receives the alert. Their orders are not subtle. Protect the rear. Engage. The 9S-36M radar comes up to full radiate. The 9A-317M transporter erector launcher slews to the threat axis. Tracking data is transmitted to the regional command posts. The system is now hot, committed, and broadcasting its electronic signature at full power across a battle space saturated with Ukrainian ELINT collectors. Phase 3, within seconds, and this is where the doctrinal trap closes, that radar emission has been triangulated. Not approximately. Precisely. Ukraine now has a coordinate-grade fix on a $67 million target whose entire survival depended on not being found. Phase 4, a second wave arrives. This is not decoys. This is real strike drones, possibly augmented by a longer-range munition cued to the now radiated coordinates. The Buk crew is still engaging the decoys when the actual killer crosses the tree line at low altitude, behind the radar arc where the system cannot defend itself. The warhead detonates on the launcher. The missiles in the tubes cook off. The radar mast collapses. The crew, if they survive, is left standing next to a smoking pile of what used to be one of the most expensive pieces of military hardware in the Russian inventory. That is not a tactical incident. That is a doctrine, and the doctrine has a name in Western military thought: suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD. But what Ukraine has done is something the United States Air Force, with all its wild weasels and HARM missiles and F-16CJs, never quite achieved at this price point. Ukraine has democratized SEAD. They have taken a mission that used to require a $100 million fighter and a $1 million missile, and they have replicated its effect with a swarm of decoys that cost less than a used car and a strike drone that costs less than a luxury sedan. This matters enormously. And here is why the broader strategic picture is worse for Russia than the loss of one Buk implies. Pull the lens back further. Every air defense system Russia loses in Donbas does three things simultaneously. First, it thins the protective umbrella over Russian troop concentrations, supply hubs, and command nodes in the immediate operational rear, meaning the next Ukrainian drone raid faces less resistance, which means more Russian infrastructure dies, which means Russian logistics degrade further. Second, it forces the surviving Russian air defense systems to either radiate less, which makes them less effective at their primary mission, or radiate more and accept the same fate. There is no middle option. Emission discipline and operational effectiveness are now mutually exclusive in eastern Ukraine. Third, and this is the part Moscow is not solving, it eats irreplaceable production capacity. The Buk M3 is not a system Russia can build at scale. Almaz-Antey, the manufacturer, was already constrained before the war by Western sanctions on advanced electronics, gallium nitride components, and high-end signal processors. Every buck lost in a tree line is a buck that will not be replaced this year, and possibly not next year either. The real question is not whether Russia can absorb one $67 million loss. The real question is what happens to the Russian theory of victory when the air defense bubble over the Donetsk axis develops permanent exploitable gaps. And the answer is what we are watching in real time. Ukrainian deep strike drones are now reaching targets in Belgorod, Voronezh, Bryansk, Rostov, and into the Volga River belt. The Russian oil refining complex is taking damage that is now visible in international fuel markets. Russian early warning radars, including the Voronezh-class strategic systems, have been struck. The Russian long-range aviation fleet has lost a meaningful percentage of its strategic bombers in successive raids. None of that is possible without first thinning the IADS in the operational forward zone, and that thinning is exactly what the Ghost unit is doing, one radar at a time, in the tree lines of Donbas. Now let me walk you through what this actually means at the climactic level, because this Buk M3 kill on its own is interesting. But the operation that turned it into a turning point was bigger than one system. In the same 2-week window that produced the Buk M3 loss, Ukrainian defense intelligence and partnered units confirmed the destruction of a Tor-M, one short-range system, the disabling of the 9 S-18M1-3 radar belonging to the same Buk M3 family, and a strike on the 55K6 command post of the S-400 battery network. Read that list again. The Tor handles the inner bubble, the point defense against drones and low-flying threats. The Buk M3 handles the middle layer, medium range against aircraft and cruise missiles. The S-400 handles the outer layer, long range against strategic platforms. Ukraine did not just kill a Buk. Ukraine struck every layer of the integrated air defense architecture in the same area of operations within the same 2 weeks, using broadly the same deception and strike methodology. That is what the Russians have not absorbed. They are still treating each loss as a discrete incident. Bad luck, a crew that broke procedure, a drone that got through. They are not yet treating it as what it actually is, which is a coordinated, repeatable, industrial-scale SEAD campaign that has rendered their entire air defense doctrine in Donbas obsolete. And until they accept that, they will continue to lose systems at this tempo, because the only way to stop the bleeding is to fundamentally redesign how the Russian air defense network operates. Change emission patterns, decentralize command, harden against decoys, retrain crews on a doctrine the Russian general staff has not even written yet. None of that happens in months. That happens in years. Ukraine does not need to give them years. History will record what happened next. In the days after the Buk M3 was destroyed, the operational consequences began to compound. Russian airstrikes from Su-34s and Su-25s over the Pokrovsk axis became measurably more cautious. Pilots will not enter a sector where they cannot be certain the friendly SAM umbrella is intact, because the next missile fired from below them might be Ukrainian. Russian reconnaissance drone coverage in the same sector thinned, because the orbiting Orlan and Zala platforms relied on the radar umbrella for survival. Ukrainian counter-battery fires improved because the suppressed Russian air defense meant Ukrainian observation drones could loiter longer. The kill chain shortens. The Russian kill chain lengthens. That is the asymmetry that wins wars, and it is happening right now in the tree lines of Donbas. This is the moment the air defense balance in eastern Ukraine tilted, and it tilted not because Ukraine acquired a new wonder weapon, but because Ukraine industrialized a method. The method is older than this war, Israeli pilots used variations of it over the Bekaa Valley in 1982. American pilots used variations of it over Iraq in 1991. But no one until now has used it with the volume, the price point, and the persistence that Ukraine has achieved in 2026. And that is the larger pattern this case confirms. Modern warfare is no longer about the cost of your platform. It is about the cost of forcing your enemy to use his platform against a target that costs you a fraction of what his response costs him. That is the equation Russia has lost. That is the equation it does not appear to know how to relearn. So what do we forecast from here? 3 things, and I will be direct about all 3. First, the rate of Russian air defense attrition in Donbas will not slow. It will accelerate. Ukraine has now demonstrated the deception and strike doctrine works at scale, and the primary unit has institutionalized it. Expect more TOR losses, more buck losses, and this is the development that matters most. Expect additional S-400 component losses in the coming months, particularly to the 9-2N6E engagement radars and the 5-5K6 command vehicles. The S-400 is not a single object. It is a network of vehicles, and Ukraine has learned which vehicles to kill first. Second, the operational consequences will radiate outward. As the Donbas air defense umbrella thins, Ukrainian deep strike drones will reach targets they could not reach before. Refineries in Saratov, Samara, and Volgograd will burn more often. Russian airfields hosting Su-34 and Su-35 squadrons within 400 kilometers of the front will find themselves under threat. The cost per sortie of Russian air power will rise because every aircraft now flies under doubt about whether its SAM cover is real or theatrical. Third, and this is the strategic verdict, the Russian theory of holding Donbas through layered air defense is now a theory of the past. It does not work. It has not worked for 6 months. It is unlikely to work again without a doctrinal redesign that Moscow has shown no capacity to execute. And the longer Moscow refuses to acknowledge that, the more $67 million systems will end their service lives as smoking wreckage in tree lines that Ukrainian drones now own. The broader lesson here is the one I want every viewer to leave with because it applies far beyond this war. When an army builds its survival on a doctrine that depends on conditions the enemy controls, that army is not defending itself. It is waiting to be killed on a schedule the enemy sets. Russia built its Donbas air defense on a mission discipline. Ukraine took control of when Russia emits. The moment that control changed hands, every Russian SAM in eastern Ukraine became a target waiting for a coordinate. The Buckham 3 was just the latest. It will not be the last. What you have just watched is not a tactical incident. It is a case study in why one side adapted, why the other side did not, and why the war in eastern Ukraine looks the way it looks today. And it is also a window into the next war, because the lessons being written in Donbas right now will be studied in every general staff college in the world for the next 30 years. The side that learns them fastest will dominate the next decade of military competition. The side that does not will discover what Russia is discovering, that the most expensive systems in your inventory are the ones the enemy can most easily turn against you. I will keep tracking this campaign as it unfolds because the next few weeks in Donbas will determine whether what we are watching is the beginning of an air defense collapse or simply the most expensive phase of a long, grinding attrition. Either way, the verdict on Russian doctrine is already in, and history will not be kind to it. If you want to stay with this analysis as it develops, and there is a great deal more to develop, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We are working toward a goal of building this into the most clear-eyed military analysis community on this platform, and every subscriber moves us closer. The next update is already being prepared because the Russians are about to lose another system, and when they do, you should understand exactly why before the headlines catch up. Stay with us. The questions ahead do not have simple answers, and the side that understands them first is the side that wins the war after this one.